The night is quiet. The city sleeps, but its streets remember. In the dim glow of lamplight, names drift like whispers carried by the wind, names of men who once ruled with both charm and cruelty. Among them, one stands taller than the rest, Salvatore Lucania, though the world would come to know him by another name. A name carved into the very history of organized crime. A name that feels heavy with mystery, fear, and a strange kind of respect. Lucky Luciano. This is not just the story of a gangster. It is the story of how crime itself was reshaped in America. Before Luciano, the underworld was scattered, filled with rival gangs clawing for scraps, killing one another in endless wars. After Luciano, it became something new, something organized, structured, and terrifyingly efficient. He wasn't just another thug in a pinstripe suit, he was the architect of a system that outlived him, a system that still casts shadows over the modern world. Imagine, for a moment, New York in the early 20th century. Smoke rising from factories, the cries of street vendors, the rumble of elevated trains. In power, Luciano's life was haunted by the inevitability of decline. The same cunning that lifted him to the top would eventually draw the attention of prosecutors, politicians, and enemies who refused to be outplayed forever. His empire, vast as it was, could not escape the slow creep of time and consequence. And so, his story is also one of downfall, of exile, and of a lonely death in a foreign land. The boy who came to America searching for opportunity ended his life far from its shores, his empire broken but his legend intact. Tonight, as we begin this journey into the shadows of his life, think of it as drifting into a dream or perhaps a nightmare. A story filled with whispers, betrayals, defend themselves were bullied, humiliated, or forgotten. Those who stood their ground earned respect. It was in these crowded, dangerous streets that Salvatore began to sharpen the instincts that would one day make him formidable. He learned when to fight and when to walk away. He learned who to trust and who to fear. And above all, he learned that in America, the rules were not written in books, they were written in blood, money, and power. But Luciano was not always the feared figure we know him as. In those early years, he was still just a boy trying to carve out a place in a world stacked against him. He worked odd jobs, shining shoes and carrying goods, anything that could bring in a few pennies for his family. Yet, like many children of the Lower East Side, he also found himself drawn to the gangs that ruled the streets. To them, the city wasn't just survival, and so, while other boys picked fights to prove themselves, Salvatore watched, listened, and learned. He studied the older gangsters the way other children might study their teachers. Every move, every gesture, every trick was a lesson to be absorbed. His first hustles were simple, running errands for older boys, delivering packages, carrying messages. Sometimes the work was harmless. Other times, it involved lookouts for petty theft or helping collect protection money from neighborhood shopkeepers. Each job carried risk, but each also came with a reward. A few coins in his pocket. A nod of respect from the older boys. A growing reputation. Slowly, Salvatore was becoming part of something larger, the invisible economy of the streets. By his teenage years, he had also discovered the games of chance that ruled the neighborhood. Dice games, card tables in backrooms, betting on horses at the track. Gambling wasn't just recreation, it was business. And Salvatore loved it. Not only the thrill of the risk, but the way it revealed people. In a single night at a card table, you could learn who was reckless, who was cautious, who could be manipulated, and who might make a dangerous enemy. Salvatore began to see life itself as one long game of strategy, where fortune favored the bold. It was around this time that the name Lucky began to follow him. Some say he earned it at the card tables, where he seemed to win more often than chance should allow. Others say it came from his survival on the streets, fights where he walked away with little more than a scratch, close calls with police that somehow never ended in prison, even stabbings where he clung to life against the odds. Whatever the origin, the name stuck. And soon, Lucky Luciano began to sound less like a street nickname and more like a title destined for history. But luck, as Luciano knew, was never enough. It had to be paired with something more, vision. Where other boys dreamed of small scores and fast cash, Luciano dreamed bigger. He looked at the chaos of the gangs around him and saw not just violence, but opportunity. Why waste energy fighting over scraps when the real wealth was in building networks, in creating order from disorder? These thoughts were still unformed in his teenage years, but they lingered, like sparks waiting for fuel. One of the most important lessons he learned during this time was about loyalty. The streets were full of betrayals, boys who would sell you out to the police for a few dollars, friends who would disappear when trouble came. But Luciano began to gather around him a small circle of men who, like him, had larger ambitions. Among them were names that would echo through history: Meyer Lansky, the brilliant strategist with a mind for numbers; Bugsy Siegel, fiery and fearless; and Frank Costello, smooth-talking and political. Together, they were still only boys, but they were already laying the foundations of alliances that would one day reshape organized crime. School, in the traditional sense, held little meaning for Salvatore. The classrooms of the Lower East Side were crowded, the teachers overworked, and the lessons far removed from the realities of street survival. By his mid-teens, Luciano had all but abandoned the path of formal education. His real school was the street corners, the backrooms, the gambling halls, and the whispered deals in dark alleys. Every mistake became a lesson. Every victory, no matter how small, was a step toward something greater. But the streets demanded a price. Arrests came early. Petty theft, assault, gambling. Luciano's rap sheet began to grow, though none of the charges stuck long enough to derail him. Each encounter with the law taught him how to adapt. He learned when to talk, when to stay silent, when to bribe, and when to fight. He saw firsthand the corruption that ran through the police force, where justice could be bought or avoided with the right connections. To Luciano, the system was not something to fear. It was something to manipulate. Even as a young man, his charm set him apart. He dressed better than most, saving what money he could for sharp suits and polished shoes. Appearance mattered. To Luciano, looking the part was as important as playing it. If you looked like a man of importance, people treated you like one. This attention to style and presence would become a signature throughout his career, distinguishing him from the rougher, less polished gangsters of his era. By the late teenage years, something larger than themselves, a network of operations that stretched from rum smuggling on the coasts to speakeasies deep in the heart of Manhattan. Bootlegging was dangerous, but it was also intoxicating in its scale. Trucks carried whiskey from Canada. Ships delivered rum from the Caribbean. Homemade stills churned out gin and moonshine in hidden basements. Police raids were constant, but Luciano understood the deeper game. Law enforcement could be bribed, judges could be bought, and politicians could be persuaded to look the other way. Money flowed as freely as the liquor itself, and with each shipment, Luciano's influence grew. But what set Luciano apart during this time was not just his involvement, but his vision. Many gangs fought recklessly, each trying to dominate a single neighborhood or shipment. Luciano looked at the map of New York and saw not fragments, but potential unity. He believed that if the gangs stopped warring and instead worked together, they could control the entire city. Prohibition, to him, was not just about profit. It was about power. Together, they formed the living, breathing fabric of America's criminal underworld. One of the most important of these men was Meyer Lansky. To the world, he was small in stature, almost unremarkable at first glance. But behind his quiet eyes was a brilliance few could match. Lansky was a mathematician of crime. Numbers bent to his will, probabilities bowed at his feet. While others gambled recklessly, Lansky calculated every risk. He saw crime not as chaos, but as a system that could be ordered, balanced, and exploited with precision. For Luciano, Lansky was not just a friend, he was a partner, the man who could take vision and turn it into arithmetic certainty. Alongside Lansky was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. If Lansky was ice, Siegel was fire. Charismatic, handsome, quick-tempered, and fearless, Siegel embodied the raw energy of the streets. Where others hesitated, Siegel acted. He was the gunman, the enforcer, the man who would walk into a room and command it with a mixture of charm and threat. Luciano valued him, not just for his loyalty, but for his unpredictability. Siegel could frighten enemies, seduce allies, and leave an impression wherever he went. Together, Lansky and Siegel formed the perfect balance, one the calculating mind, the other the daring hand. And then there was Frank Costello, smooth as silk, his voice calm, his words persuasive. Costello was unlike the others. Where Siegel reached for his gun, Costello reached for a handshake. He understood politics, not in the narrow sense of government, but in the broader sense of influence. He cultivated friendships with judges, with police captains, with politicians who could make inconvenient laws disappear. He was the diplomat of the group, the man who could walk comfortably in both the underworld and the halls of legitimate power. With Costello at his side, Luciano's empire began to feel untouchable. But allies were only half the story. For every friend, there was a rival waiting in the shadows. The most dangerous of them was Joe, the boss Masseria, a Sicilian-born gangster who ruled New York with an iron hand. Masseria embodied the old ways, loyalty to Sicilian tradition, distrust of outsiders, and a brutal reliance on violence to settle disputes. To him, Luciano was useful, but also dangerous. Luciano, in turn, respected Masseria's power, but quietly resented his outdated methods. Their uneasy alliance would not last forever. Opposite Masseria stood another figure, Salvatore Marangino, elegant, ambitious, and deeply rooted in Sicilian custom. He too saw Luciano as a tool and perhaps as a threat. Marangino dreamed of being the supreme leader of all Italian gangs in America. He carried himself like a general from the old country, enforcing ancient codes of loyalty and obedience. To younger men like Luciano, this was stifling. The old guard wanted to guided him, keep violence quiet, keep profits flowing, and always look beyond the small picture. This web of allies and rivals created a world both fragile and explosive. Alliances were made in whispers, sealed with handshakes, and sometimes broken in blood. A man might be a partner today and an enemy tomorrow. Luciano thrived in this uncertainty. He could charm Lansky with vision, inspire Siegel with action, reassure Costello with diplomacy, and at the same time, keep Masseria and Marangiano believing he was loyal to them. He played the game on multiple boards at once, each move careful, each risk calculated. But beneath this balancing act, tensions simmered. The old guard clung to tradition. The younger generation sought change. Money flowed, but blood spilled just as quickly. The city was a cauldron, and sooner or later, it would boil over. For Luciano, these years were about more than building an empire. They were about studying people, testing relationships, and learning how to control not just businesses, but men. Every ally offered a tool, every rival offered a warning. Together, they formed the crucible in which Luciano's true power would be forged. As night fell over New York, one could almost imagine these figures moving through the fog, Siegel with his quick grin, Lansky with his calculating eyes, Costello with his soft words, Masseria with his heavy hand, Marangiano with his commanding presence. And somewhere in the middle, watching them all, waiting for the perfect moment, stood Lucky Luciano. The stage was set. The friendships were sealed. The rivalries were sharpened. Soon, they would clash in a storm of violence and betrayal, the Castellammarese War, a conflict that would reshape the mafia forever. But before the first shots were fired, the alliances and rivalries of these men painted the portrait of an underworld on the brink of transformation. Before Luciano could become a kingmaker, he first had to meet the man who taught him how to think like one. That man was Arnold Rothstein, the gambler, the financier, the quiet genius who many believe was the true godfather of American organized crime. Rothstein's shadow stretched far across New York in the 1920s, and to a young Lucky Luciano, he was more than just a powerful figure. He was a teacher, a mentor, and perhaps even a glimpse of the future. Rothstein was unlike any gangster Luciano had ever seen. Born into wealth, well-educated, and impeccably dressed, Rothstein moved through the city not with fists or threats, but with calm calculation. Where the typical gangster swaggered in smoky bars, Rothstein dined in elegant restaurants, rubbing shoulders with politicians, judges, and businessmen. He was not a man of the streets, he was a man of influence. And influence, Luciano realized, was far more valuable than brute force. Rothstein made his fortune not by robbing banks or fighting turf wars, but by controlling games of chance. He was a gambler, yes, but a gambler with the mind of a financier. He had a knack for fixing outcomes, most infamously, the 1919 World Series, which he allegedly helped manipulate. To Rothstein, crime was not about chaos. It was about order, about numbers, about strategy. He thought in terms of systems, not scraps. When Luciano entered Rothstein's circle, he was still rough around the edges. Sharp, ambitious, and street smart, but not yet polished. Rothstein saw potential in him. He recognized in Luciano something many others had overlooked, the rare ability to blend charm with ruthlessness, vision with pragmatism. And so, Rothstein took him under his wing, offering not just jobs but lessons that would stay with Luciano for life. The first lesson was about discipline. Rothstein taught Luciano that violence was a tool, but not the foundation of power. Anyone could pull a trigger, but not everyone could build an empire. True power, Rothstein explained, came from restraint, knowing when to act and when to wait, when to negotiate and when to intimidate. A man who killed recklessly made enemies. A man who planned carefully built longevity. Luciano absorbed this lesson deeply, and it would later define his leadership style. The second lesson was about appearance. Rothstein always dressed impeccably, always carried himself like a man of importance. He understood that in America, perception was often more powerful than reality. If you looked successful, people treated you as successful. If you looked respectable, doors opened. Castellammarese War, a name borrowed from the small Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo, birthplace of one of the key figures in the conflict. For nearly 2 years, the city lived under the shadow of gunfire, betrayal, and bloodshed. And in the middle of it all, playing both sides with careful precision, stood lucky Luciano. The war was born from a clash between the old ways and the new vision. On one side was Joe, the boss Masseria, the self-proclaimed king of the Sicilian underworld in New York. Masseria represented the traditions of the old country. He demanded loyalty from fellow Sicilians, trusted only men from his own heritage, and ruled through brute force and intimidation. To him, the underworld was a kingdom, and he was its monarch. On allies. The plan was set. On 15 April 1931, Luciano arranged a meeting with Masseria at Nuova Villa Tammaro, a Coney Island restaurant table, dead with his playing hand still clenched. The so-called boss of bosses had been betrayed not by enemies, but by the man he trusted most. The killing sent shockwaves through the underworld. For many, it was unthinkable that a lieutenant would turn on his boss so coldly. But for Luciano, it was necessary. Masseria's death ended one half of the struggle, but it was only part of the plan. The war was not yet truly over because another man remained. Salvatore Marangino. For a brief moment after Masseria's murder, Marangino stood triumphant. He declared himself the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He reorganized the mafia into families, each with a structure of boss, underboss, capos, and soldiers. To the outside world, it seemed as though Marangino had brought order to the chaos. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Luciano quickly saw the truth. Marangino, like Masseria, was chained to the old world. His obsession with Roman titles, his demand for absolute obedience, his arrogance, it was only another form of tyranny. Worse, Marangino began to suspect Luciano's ambitions. Whispers reached him that Luciano might one day betray him too. In response, Marangino plotted his own strike, secretly hiring hitmen to eliminate Luciano before he became a threat. But Luciano had ears everywhere. He learned of the plot before it could be carried out. And once again, he chose betrayal over loyalty, preemptive action over patience. On 10 September 1931, Marangino summoned Luciano to a meeting at his office on Park Avenue. But Luciano did not go. Instead, he sent others, men not easily recognized by Marangino's guards, men Marangino would not expect. Jewish gunmen, disguised as federal agents, walked into Marangino's building with badges and pistols hidden beneath their jackets. Marangino must have felt a flicker of relief when they arrived, believing he was being visited by government men. But relief quickly turned to terror. The agents drew their weapons, pounced on him, and in a flurry of violence, Salvatore Marangino was stabbed and shot to death. The so-called Caesar of the American mafia was gone, undone by the very man he thought he could control. Two betrayals, two deaths, within months of each other. With Masseria and Marangino both gone, the war ended not with victory for either side, but with the rise of something new. Luciano emerged as the survivor, the architect. The murders of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Marangiano ended one chapter of New York's underworld and opened another. For the first time in decades, the old Sicilian bosses were gone, their grip on the city broken. In their scandals filling the headlines. But in reality, beneath the surface, order was taking root. Decisions were no longer made in back-alley quarrels, but in secret meetings where men in sharp suits debated like businessmen. The mafia was no longer just a gang, it was an institution. And Luciano himself became something of a myth. He carried himself differently now, less like a gangster, more like a statesman of the underworld. He was calm, deliberate, and always calculating. He knew when to speak and when to remain silent. He allowed others to shine in public while he worked quietly in the background. This humility was strategic. By avoiding the spotlight, he avoided becoming a target. He let the commission appear as a collective, even though his influence ran through every decision it made. For the rank-and-file soldiers, life changed as well. The structure of the 5 families gave them clearer paths of loyalty and protection. They knew to whom they reported, and they knew the rules of the game. Violating those rules brought punishment, but following them brought rewards. This sense of order strengthened loyalty, for men trusted that their efforts would not be wasted in meaningless wars. Of course, the commission was not perfect. Violence never disappeared entirely, it was, after all, the foundation of power. But now it was calculated, controlled, used sparingly rather than recklessly. Killings became tools of strategy, not eruptions of pride. To Luciano, this was progress. It made the mafia more efficient, more sustainable, and ultimately, more dangerous. The timing could not have been better. Prohibition was nearing its end, and with it, one of the mafia's greatest sources of income. Many worried that the end of bootlegging would. Luciano's system ensured that profits were divided fairly, disputes settled quietly, and expansion pursued strategically. Where other gangs had bled themselves dry in endless rivalries, Luciano's commission kept the peace. The result was staggering. His organization earned millions each year, wealth beyond the dreams of the boys who once hustled on the Lower East Side. But money alone was never enough. Luciano understood that real power required something deeper, respect. And he pursued it not only through fear but through charm. He dressed impeccably in tailored suits, moved with the confidence of a man who belonged in any room, and spoke with a calm authority that demanded attention. To businessmen, he looked like a partner. To politicians, he looked like a supporter. To the underworld, he looked like a leader. He used this respect to weave himself into the fabric of the city. Judges could be bribed, police captains persuaded, district leaders courted. Through Frank Costello, Luciano's political arm, envelopes of cash found their way into the right hands. Soon, entire neighborhoods moved under his silent protection. Raids were avoided. Arrests were delayed. Trials were dismissed. Luciano didn't just run rackets, he ran influence. Meanwhile, Meyer Lansky, violence was not for ego, it was for necessity. Still, success carried with it an undercurrent of danger. The more Luciano built, the more enemies he created. Rival gangs resented his control. Old Sicilian traditionalists whispered that he had betrayed their heritage by working with Jews and Irishmen. Law enforcement, though often bribed, grew uneasy at the scale of his operations. And in the shadows, ambitious men watched, waiting for their chance to climb. But for now, in the mid-1930s, Luciano stood unchallenged. His empire generated millions, his commission kept the peace, and his network of allies gave him influence far beyond the reach of most gangsters. He had taken the chaos of the streets and molded it into an empire. It was, in many ways, the golden age of Lucky Luciano. The boy from Sicily, once just another immigrant hustler in the Lower East Side, had risen to become the father of organized crime in America. He had outsmarted rivals, betrayed kings, and built a system that turned gangsters into businessmen. The city itself seemed to bend around him. The jazz clubs played, the dice rolled, the glasses clinked, and somewhere in the background, Luciano's hand touched it all. His reign was quiet, efficient, and for a time, untouchable. But history is never kind to kings, no matter how cleverly they rule. For Luciano, the peak of power would soon give way to scrutiny, betrayal, and downfall. Enemies were gathering. Politicians grew restless. And one ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey was about to turn his gaze toward the man in the shadows. He knew how to flatter them, how to speak their language. He didn't lecture about loyalty or Sicilian honor. He talked about opportunity, about mutual benefit, about keeping the wheels of the city turning. Many of these men convinced themselves that Luciano was different from other gangsters, that the city called him a legend. And in the twilight between charm and ruthlessness, he reigned as the gentleman gangster, untouchable and unmatched. For all his charm, his polish, and his vision of organized crime as a kind of the scale was unprecedented, the profits immense. And Luciano, always the strategist, ensured that the money flowed upward, neatly distributed, feeding the families of the commission and keeping his allies satisfied. The brothels themselves were often hidden behind ordinary facades. A beauty parlor, a tailor's shop, a restaurant, behind these doors, business could not be bought. He would not be intimidated. And he carried the full support of the public, who saw in him a champion against corruption. Luciano's usual tools, charm, money, influence, were suddenly less effective. As the net tightened, Luciano tried to keep his composure. He continued to run his empire, attending meetings, giving orders, and projecting calm. But behind the scenes, he grew uneasy. He had built his fortune on the assumption that the law could always be bent. Now, for the first time, he faced an enemy who would not bend. In 1936, Dewey struck decisively. He indicted Luciano on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The headlines blazed across newspapers, "Vice King indicted." Luciano's name, once a whisper, was suddenly shouted from every front page. To the public, he was no longer the mysterious gentleman gangster. He was the face of vice, the man accused of exploiting women on a massive scale. The trial that followed was a spectacle. Dewey presented his witnesses one by one, painting a picture of Luciano as the mastermind behind a vast and immoral enterprise. The women who testified, the city that once seemed to belong to Luciano now belonged to his enemy. The empire remained, but its leader was caged. For the first time, Lucky Luciano's future seemed uncertain. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches, their pens poised to capture every detail. Each day, public opinion tilted further in Dewey's favor. And then came the closing arguments. Dewey spoke with conviction, his words ringing with finality. He told the jury that this was their chance to strike at the heart of organized crime, to show that no man, he rarely complained, rarely drew attention to his discomfort. Instead, He observed, learned the rhythms of prison, and began to carve out his place within it. Prison life also revealed Luciano's ability to command respect without raising his voice. Among inmates, he quickly became a figure of quiet influence. Some were awed simply by his reputation. Others gravitated toward his calm presence, sensing that even here, he was a man to be followed. Luciano did not rule the prison with violence. He did not need to. His reputation, the same man they had caged as a criminal, would soon be asked for help as a patriot. For now, though, in the cold stone of the Nemora, he waited. He worked, he walked, he listened. He adapted. Lucky Luciano was no longer the king of New York. It restored a measure of relevance to his name, transforming him in the eyes of some from a disgraced gangster into a man of usefulness. When the war ended, his lawyers argued that his contributions should be rewarded with clemency. Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, now governor of New York, faced a dilemma. To deny the request would seem ungrateful, to grant it would appear scandalous. In 1946, the decision came. Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence on the condition families through letters and visitors. In truth, his influence was more limited than the legends suggested. He remained a respected figure, but not the commanding force he had once been. Exile also brought isolation. In New York, Luciano had been surrounded by allies, protected by networks. Some investigators swore he was the mastermind of a global narcotics syndicate, linking Italian suppliers with American distributors. Others argued by the late 1950s he was more a symbol than a ruler. The heroin pipelines continued, the mafia in America guessed toward the terminal. Luciano suddenly collapsed. His body crumpled, his cigarette falling from his fingers. A heart attack had struck him down instantly. The man who had survived assassins, betrayals, prison, and exile was undone not by bullets or knives, but by the relentless hand of time. The gentleman gangster was still, at his core, a man who profited from misery. This contrast between visionary leader and